got to have a socialist perspective.
Problem of how to organize industrial society on truly democratic lines.
That all the tides of history are flowing in our direction.
All right, welcome back to our podcast. This is the second episode. It's going to be about the coronavirus and the COVID depression. So, capitalism and decay. We're going to be talking about a couple of things here, mostly relating to how we, the UK, have reacted to the coronavirus, how we could have reacted better, how we, should have prepared for it better. And I think the most interesting part is going to be how we're going to have to change after, if there is an after the coronavirus, and what sort of future is going to be laid out for us. So I think to begin with, we're going to do a quick sort of overview of pre-corona, what should have been done, what wasn't done during the early phases of corona. So for us, this was in our time about February, when we knew corona was in China. It started to spread to other countries, the ones nearby, South Korea, Taiwan, Vietnam.
Just a correction, in January.
January and February.
Yeah, January.
And then, by late February, early March, we knew it was in Europe. And so we're going to have a small discussion about that. Then we're going to talk about what's going wrong now that it is in the UK. Are we doing anything right? What are we doing right? And more importantly, what's going wrong? So pre-coronavirus, Greg. Why has coronavirus seemingly hit us worse than other countries? Were we less prepared from the get-go? What is it?
Essentially less prepared. So there was a report in 2018 by the National Security Capability Review, 2018 March, and 2 points of which they emphasise as being growing issues for Britain and Britain's national security was organised crime and also natural diseases and natural disasters. And from this, there was in 26, even before this, people knew that something like coronavirus, that is a pandemic, would happen. A lot of the reasons being we're an increasingly connected world. Things like SARS and other diseases were sort of, again, instances where this blew up. SARS in particular came from essentially the same place, which was wet markets. It's in China. And so there was a test of the preparedness of the NHS to actually respond to a pandemic. And the project was called Sinus in 2016. And essentially the report came to the conclusion that the NHS would just fail completely because it was so unprepared. And for a whole host of reasons, lack of ventilators and PPE were one of the main ones up there in the scenario. So it was known to the government, inside the government, that a thing like this could happen, or it was very likely to happen. In the report, the National Security Capability Report 2018, they predicted in 5 or so years this thing would come. And
from what you're saying as well, what it sounds like is they knew what could have been done. So what you're saying, because there are not enough ventilators, there are not enough personal protective equipment, they knew what should have been done. They knew they should have started buying some.
Exactly. And
filling up their stock. Started buying gowns, starting masks, gloves, ventilators, all of that. Why was this? So this report, it seems like the logical thing here to do would be to start doing all of that. If we know this is a very high risk for our country, and I think, interestingly enough, also knife crime was a really big thing for us a few years ago. What is, because you were talking about organised crime being another big risk. What is the big, why didn't we do that? Why has it turned out that we don't have all of this protective equipment?
Well, according to this quite famous Sunday Times article that's come out called 30 Days Britain Sleepwalked into Disaster, a source to the news article said that essentially the entirety of policy planning and policy effort was going into Brexit more than anything else. The main reason being that Brexit was thing where it was at the forefront of the agenda. It looked glossy. There was massive coverage of the whole 4-year whole episode that is Brexit and thus leaving the EU. And so there wasn't really any time or any effort spent on preparing for the pandemic. And the result is We've got a death toll, I think, that's higher than Spain right now, and Spain was famously another really badly hit country. I think
as of right now, the 4th of May, I think we're at almost 29,000.
Yeah. And
I'm going to look up Spain. Spain are at 25,000. Yeah, we are above Spain now.
Yeah. Yeah. So again, it's really kicking up speed here in the UK.
We're a few hundred behind Italy.
Yeah, and Italy has been like the quintessential failed country.
And also, Italy is well ahead of us on the process. They are a few weeks ahead of us.
Yeah, exactly.
So,
and so the government reaction really from the beginning was herd immunity. So very famously on Good Morning Britain, Boris turned up and told people to take it on the chin. Another thing was also we were quite slow. So Italy, for example, closed their schools on the 8th, when we closed our schools on the 20th of March, that Friday.
But I think on that, it is worth noting, because we were further behind on the curve, it's probably about a similar time. But also, the thing with the herd immunity is, in some ways, I think it was made a bigger deal of than it was. I think they talked about it, and Tim Hancock in that meeting, obviously, people did sort of slate him for it. Matthew Hancock, my bad. I think that was at a point where the only reason the herd immunity was really spoken about was because they knew that herd immunity is obviously the easiest policy to implement.
Yeah.
Because you do nothing, you sit on your ass.
Exactly, and economically it's extremely viable compared to social
viable. It is, and they knew that because of the fucking failed preparation, because they, knew they should have done all these things, and like them saying, go around wearing protective masks, stay at home, but they can't wear protective masks. And if they're saying we're going to do we're going to lock down like China did, we're going to start building hospitals in 3 days like China did, they can't do that. We don't have the means to do that.
Exactly.
So instantly, all of these things are off the table to begin with.
Yeah.
And they didn't. So to me, the herd immunity it wasn't an actual idea that they thought, this is what the scientists are telling us. It was more, this is what is most easily available. And I think they sort of had their fingers crossed that it maybe could work.
And it wouldn't likely to, yeah.
It's it's a bit of a pipe dream.
And yeah, and then it just didn't. And people pointed out very early that this was sort of ludicrous. And the result is that, tens of thousands of people would die. 28,000 people have died already, 27,000. But way more could have died if herd immunity was really carried on. Another point is to make is that, so the idea of social distancing, I imagine for them as sort of, policy advisors and civil servants who've had their jobs for decades now, a few of them, especially the high-ranking ones, they wouldn't think that forcing and telling the British people to stay inside and all the economic disruption that would bring, they didn't think that would be a viable policy. I mean, it turns out that social distancing is, I think, one of the most popular policies of the last few decades. It's hysterically popular because it's sort of, reignites.
Yeah, I was reading that. I think I just think a few weeks ago I read something like 80% of people think the government could go further with social distancing and they'd be okay with that.
I think like 57 of the majority of people, I think this is YouGov poll, said that they didn't want to go back to normal life. They didn't want to go back to work or something like this. They're sort of doing it, which is
they hermits.
Which is yeah. I mean, whether that's actually true, there's obviously massive consequences to social distancing for a lot of people who have precarious jobs and need those jobs, and they can't really survive on 80% of their wage or other situations. But moving from that, I'm moving to the current. The current is obviously massive loans to small businesses and big businesses. There's an effort to make them more accessible. There's a furlough and staff scheme. Self-employed people have some help too, but that's to a certain degree. This was a question of bailing out companies. So a big one is Virgin, which is being hit pretty hard because it is aviation. It's in airlines, and no one's buying anything. And yeah. And so now the conversations come down to, the main conversation is, what are we going to do next? So, Amos, what are the options?
Well, basically, I think the sort of worst case scenario nightmare is waiting until there's a vaccine and then, you know, drastically, you know, letting go of the lockdown. I think what seems to be most popular at the moment is sort of minor policies to be done. I think some countries, I think Sweden now is letting under 10s back into school. So obviously we're going to be watching how that happens, whether we can start letting our lower school children back in to schools, whether that's going to work. Slowly starting to let smaller businesses reopen. I think within the last week, KFC, Pret, and somewhere else started opening their delivery again, so you can do that. And I think that's what we're going to do. I think the talk about a sort of, because I think now it's very clear that we can't have a second wave. If we, you know, let go now, it's like, I don't know, it would just be
it's an experiment and we're risking more lives, essentially.
We can't just relax everything now. That would, I think, be a drastic error, basically. You know, the infection isn't at a point where most people are now immune or whatever, so it would just there'd be a second wave and we'd all be fucked basically again, and all of that lockdown would have been for nothing. So I think the smaller steps is the most popular approach. I think fair enough, but there's also, I think what they are talking about now as well that's going to help the smaller steps is the app the NHS wants to make, which is going to be basically, you know, they'd ideally want everyone to install it and, you know, say whether they'd had it or not, and then it'll give notifications to who you've been in contact with. You know, have you been in contact with someone who's had it? And that is supposedly going to be a big help. It's pissing me a bit off that the NHS wants to make it all by themselves rather than enlisting Google, who already have all these. You know, they basically would have that ready, or Apple. You know, when so many people are on an Apple device or whatever. But that's another option, but I think people are a bit wary of that. It sounds a bit, you know, people are worried about civil liberties. What is being breached? Are they going to know everywhere I'm going, everyone who I'm speaking to? Well, yeah, basically they would have to for this to work, and more importantly, it would have to be used by at least 60% of the population to work. Because if only 20% of the population is using it, then who the fuck cares?
Exactly. So this track and trace policy is being backed by this company called Palantir, which is an American company. And again, just using basic data information you put in to just track and see if you've come into contact with any of coronavirus and whatnot. Because the economic situation is worsened to such an extent to it, so that you really can't carry on. I mean, the GDP of England is going to contract massively, I think between 3 or 8%, which essentially means a recession. Well, one more quarter, and it's definitely going to be a recession, and that's obvious. And it's really a question to the degree. Unemployment is going to also skyrocket, and you really can't. And also, there's this ideological discomfort from the people in government, like Rishi Sunak, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, who, you know, comes from a hedge fund background. All of these people in government are pretty much sort of free market neoliberal types. They feel that the free market is the best way to go through with life. The free market knows everything, and so to have the state basically pushing through funding and being the main investor causes them a lot of discomfort. And so they want to try and find a way to leave the increasingly dire economic situation. And track and trace is one of those ways. But it's very interesting, track and trace, because it's again bringing back this sort of Orwellian tendency we saw with Edward Snowden and all of the leaks about GCHQ and MI5 and MI6 spying on citizens, and also Cambridge Analytica.
To me, it's really reminiscent of, I think, either last year or 2 years ago. Do you remember when that news about China creating their app that measures if someone is in debt around you as part of their like social credit policy? So
Nice.
if you're on your phone, it would notify you if someone within your like 5 meter radius is in debt. Where then it was part of their social credit policy. The fact that you would be notified about something, which I guess is personal, but I guess also for the collective public health is good. But the fact that it would be necessary to constantly be tracking who's in contact with who,
Yeah.
and I mean, presumably this data, well, it can't be deleted because you constantly need to know that. So I mean, A, it leads to sort of, what if there's a data breach? Fuck.
Yeah.
And B, more importantly, does the government have the right? Because that seems like something that a lot of people, me included, I would accept it because it is something that's going to benefit us long term, but it would make me deeply uncomfortable because when you check the agree thing when you've got your new phone or whatever, and I don't care if Samsung knows because it's sort of me. I kind of agree to that, and it's like, yeah, fine, like whatever. But when it's the government, and I feel like in this case we wouldn't have much of a say. There wouldn't be a sort of referendum type thing, and it's not something that could have been predicted in the last election.
Yeah.
It's just something that's going to be put upon us,
Yeah.
and we have to do it basically. And that, I know. It's sort of ironic how you're talking about how the government wants to go back to a sort of neoliberal model,
Yeah.
or wants to get back into wants to get the economy booming again. And London's losing 2.4 billion a day in profits. Jesus Christ, they want to get them profits back.
Yeah.
But to me, it seems ironic having to implement a policy that seems so against the neoliberal, or not even neoliberal, just the liberal ideas of civic freedom. I think there is irony there.
Well, interesting enough, we're talking about Palantir, which is backing the NHS with its track and trace app. Palantir is an American company, and you look at the US, they've been speaking about improved and greater control and handling of personal data. So going back to Cambridge Analytica, just to demonstrate the limits or the potential of having private data, they use private personal data that you signed away while playing some app or something on Facebook or whatever, to then go through, try to target you in some election campaign, which comes off, as most people, and I would definitely agree with them, it comes off extremely manipulative and an undermining of even bourgeois notions of democracy, in which it's like an Athenian forum, a Greek forum, and you talk about ideas. It's just here, sort of manipulative, propagandistic, brainwashing, essentially through the flooding of adverts. And so this the National Security Committee on AI, they were speaking about the fact that big data is personal data is the new oil, essentially, and China has far more of this, incredible
commodity
oil, because again, it has so much control and oversight, and to an obviously Orwellian degree, over their own people. And you see America, and the main thrust of pushing that in America is the fact that America wants to maintain its technological advantage, which it sees as national security, insofar as it can exert power over countries. So and they want to again impose this sort of Chinese model of complete oversight through this. And I think COVID-19 has been an opportunity to justify and validate the implementation of an increasingly overbearing surveillance state, of which they themselves wanted. I could have added about the UK. The US has an obvious overt sort of drive to become, in many ways, like China.
Well, I think since the Blair days, we do I think there is an element of that in the UK as well. I think
Definitely.
I think for us, for every 13 civilians, we have a security camera up in the UK, which is the highest of any country globally. There is an act, so the Snoopers Charter, which was this draft legislation proposed by then Home Secretary Theresa May, which would require internet service providers and mobile phone companies to maintain records of each user's internet browsing activity. Now that is fucked up well, not fucked up, but that is pretty Orwellian, as you would say. I mean, that is something, we expect out of China at this point. And it obviously hasn't happened because the logistics of it are impossible. You would need, fucking like blocks and blocks and blocks of buildings just to store this data. And it's impossible for, Google or whoever to like realistically maintain all this data. It's not realistic.
No, yeah, and
they haven't done it.
Yeah, it's a state-backed way of controlling. It has to be state-backed, yeah.
I think importantly, it shows that we're going in that direction.
Yeah.
And I think it's something that would have been much harder to pass without COVID. But now we're seeing, now it's sort of easier to veil it as this is helpful.
Yeah.
Because, and I mean, it is. That's the, well, I don't know if it's a good or a bad thing, but that's the thing about it.
Yeah,
it is
evidently
it will be helpful to us. Evidently, it makes sense. It's a policy that makes complete sense. But it's just, will it lead us into a direction that's too far? Will we?
Well, Well, this mirrors the Patriot Act in America. So when the Twin Towers fell, and obviously 9/11, and the plane that hit the Pentagon, in I think 10 days or maybe something a bit more, for 2 weeks, Dick Cheney and Bush brought out this massive document. I mean, thousands of pages, called the Patriot Act. And the Patriot Act got rid of tons of things. It attacked habeas corpus. It expanded the amount of time you could be detained for terrorists. But also, this obviously comes towards infringing on the rights of American citizens themselves. And this was a massive act that was written, that somehow, thousands of pages, people in Congress didn't have the time to read it. It was that massive. And it was so clear that people like Cheney, who himself had been working in the Ford administration in the 70s, was for a very long time preparing this document, which could act as a way to, increase the power of the American state in the people's lives. And the same way 9/11 was an opportunity and a way to justify the introduction of the Patriot Act. So will COVID-19 do the same thing? And while we're talking about
the thing with these sort of crises is that it is an opportunity for the government to overstep its traditional boundaries in the name of protecting the people in the face of this crisis. So, with 9/11, it was a chance for things like the Patriot Act, for things like Middle Eastern intervention. And it happens every crisis. And, we see, even here after the 2008 crash, we're doing things that shouldn't normally be done, but it has been done under the veil of, it has to be done.
Helping the country,
crisis.
And the reaction to 2008 is important because
I think
the dynamics are going to be the same, in which there's this massive crisis, and the question is how would you stimulate the economy, and how would you get the country growing again?
And I think the thing about that, so right now we're losing, I mentioned it earlier, 2.4 billion a day from London.
Yeah.
But and that's a day, all of the austerity measures that the Tories implemented saved us around 30 billion total. That's 30 billion total is essentially nothing when we're comparing to 2.4 billion a day. So 30 billion over the last 10 years compared to 2.4 billion a day. And it makes you think, at the moment, we're managing under this lockdown, even though we're losing all of this profit daily.
Yeah.
So it makes you think, that 30 billion that was taken away from social services, from healthcare, from education, was it necessary? If we're okay losing 2.4 billion a day as we are now, I say okay, speaking for me personally, I can't really speak for everyone. And obviously there are lots of people who are struggling, but that money could have been gotten in other ways.
Yeah.
And I think the damage it instills the policy of austerity is so much more than, you know, the 30 billion we got from it. And in from that, it just lasted longer than it should have from this crisis. It's another one of those policies that is, you know, was created during crisis time. And I mean, I guess, you know, you could say, you know, we didn't leave the recession, but I think at a certain point it was no longer necessary, or a different aspect should have been taken because it was generally just so harmful.
It was, I mean, it was a reflection of, it was really ideological and class-based austerity. I mean, the austerity narrative is essentially, imagine the countries like this is like Theresa May. She was like, imagine your country, a country is like your bank account. You can't spend more money than you have. But in actuality, countries don't function like this because countries have, well, firstly, what a country spends affects their income. So my income and your income is working. The country's income is taxes. And that is affected by social policies you have that work in a way to stimulate the economy, like this social security, like the NHS, that have obviously a positive effect on the lives of people, because basically it gives people money and they can go out and spend. So, and then the argument was made that because, you know, the country's like a bank account, we must cut on spending. And the effect of it was really, one, to kill off any growth that was happening in 2009 when we still under Labour government under Brown. It killed it completely off in 2010. What it also did was, well, one, it was extremely horrific policy. I mean, the reason why the living conditions in the UK, things like
life expectancy,
has begun to essentially stagnate instead of growing year on year as you expect it happening. And this is a direct result of austerity, which cut things like the NHS, which cut things like council budgets. I think there was an Oxford report that said in 2015, 30,000 people died because of an underfunded NHS, you know. And if you put out for the whole years, it could come up to like 120,000. It's massive. And the real destruction of a lot of people's lives isn't because of the recession. It's because of how the government reacted to the recession. And again, there will be another conversation about how we're going to react to this crisis in public finance, you know, because taxes are going to go down because there's not much demand or activity, economically speaking. So there's going to be two possible choices. One is austerity, in which you cut away public finances in an attempt to bring down the deficit. And that's the only aim, to bring down the deficit. And then from that, a deficit reduction would lead to better public finances and a healthy economy. On the other hand, it has a massively de-stimulating effect on the economy as a whole. And another option, apart from austerity, is Keynesian, you know, just basically a lot of funding, high government spending. And the reality is that government debt isn't like my debt or your debt. Like there's not an overdraft. I mean, the interest on government debt is tiny as compared to like overdrafts on your credit card, because the main reason being that governments usually do pay back on a bond, for example, because governments are pretty secure. They're like, it's a very secure market, buying government bonds, buying government debt, because governments always have to pay back. So yeah, that's as I would say, my argument is that we should look towards more Keynesian policies of stimulating the economy directly through state intervention.
All right. Well, I think in the build-up to the coronavirus, the Tory government evidently disagreed with you. They believed in stimulating the economy, but this was done by doing nothing, basically, by keeping the country open for longer than would have seemed advisable, by having a lockdown later. I remember, like, it was the last day of school for us ever, a couple of days before the lockdown, and I remember thinking it was crazy. So what, like 1,000 students, you know, we're all like hugging each other, everyone's like, oh, goodbye, blah blah blah, you know. Then you go down to the pub and you see all of those people, and then we went to another pub, and it's like, there's absolutely no way
someone's
that,
coughing.
like, exactly. There's absolutely no way that out of the few hundred people frequenting these pubs, no one had coronavirus. There's absolutely no way. And it makes you think like
Yeah.
something something at least should have been in measure to stop
Yeah.
all of these mass gatherings. And it was
Mm.
we didn't really we had advice basically of like, don't go out in large numbers. It
Yeah.
was just that advice up until the point of an actual lockdown.
Yeah.
And even once the lockdown had happened, people
Mhm.
still were going out in their numbers
Mhm.
to parks and things. And it was only once
Yeah. Exactly.
police got involved that people would actually stay at home. So
Yeah.
I mean, we can't pin it all on the government. It is partly because we're twats and we just kept going out.
But I mean, the twat thing is like it has to be brought into the political calculation. Like you cannot, you have to assume as a government, what can you as the government do? There's
Yeah.
only so much. And
yeah, I guess.
I,
Yeah.
I
So
think,
maybe
yeah. But I mean, austerity. Talk about austerity a bit more. It's had a really damaging effect, and another big part of government action is to outsource massively. So talking about Palantir, a private US company dealing with the NHS in creating this app, but around the country in councils, there is a massive. Well, there's been for a very long time since Thatcher, a massive push to outsource all council services to private firms. Famously here in Barnet, it's Capita, which has had a horrific reputation for their essentially inaptitude and inability with dealing with things like pension schemes that had to be, I think, that had to be taken away from them, that contract. Council accommodation checkups, essentially, that's run by Capita, which has failed massively. And so what's it called? There's in West Hendon, there's several council blocks, and of which the living conditions are getting worse because of the ineptitude of Capita. And Capita, has a decade-long contract of tens of millions. And and again, outsourcing is a wonderful manifestation of the neoliberal ideology. The market can do everything. We should shrink the state and instead have markets play the role of council servicer, council provider, essentially. And the result has been basically there's been no change. I mean, the promise was that these firms would do a better job, and in fact they haven't. And this is across the sector. So a massive example of this is in adult social care, and adult social care has come under a massive strain because of coronavirus. A week ago, or 2 weeks ago, there's a letter from all of the heads of the adult social care sector writing a letter towards the government saying the supply lines for PPE is shambolic, the advice is completely incoherent, and they're not getting enough tests for the care workers. And again, adult social care has been gutted, essentially. The vast majority of the sector, as compared with the 80s, is now completely private. And what's actually happened is that wages have gone down massively because now the aim is to increase profit. So the wages of care workers in the private sector is almost half of those compared with those in the public sector. There's increasing market fragility. So you have massive adult social care companies that represent 10% of the entire share of the country and bigger shares in different areas. They then just collapse because they're private companies. They don't have state backing. And if they can't do it for a profit, investors will pull their money out or stop investing and it will just collapse. And because of this, you have a deteriorating situation, not just because of COVID-19, but because of the backdrop of the British economy, which is neoliberal policies and a neoliberal ideological core, which is its only effect in reality is to concentrate wealth. I mean, instead of spending X amount of money on public services as a council, you instead spend the same amount or even more on paying for some private company to do the same job. Wages go down, and more wages go up to people who own the companies than the company execs and whatnot. And as we see, the inequalities skyrocketed massively, and that again is impacting on coronavirus, because you have thousands of not unemployed but precariously employed people who have 0-hour contracts. Again, a neoliberal policy in which the priority is the profit, not the lives of the people or the workers. And the result is that in the situation, people who are precariously employed are losing tons of money. People who are self-employed can't get access to the right money unless they have it unless they work. Well, no, unless their self-employment acts as or is the majority of their income and other criteria. I mean, an increasingly precarious situation for the people at the low society or people at the top have this concentrated wealth, and coronavirus has really brought that out. And
I agree.
And another discussion that's quite important again about the economy is opening up the country, because that gives you an edge time-wise in being the country that can produce things, export things, and sell them, as compared with other countries, and that can that increases the size of the economy. And so there's this, but also it's detrimental effect if you're slow, because there's someone out there who's doing the job you could be doing as a company in, say, Britain, but you can't do because you're still closed down. And so it's a increasingly worsening situation in which the capitalist neoliberal ideology is worsening day in and day out.
Thanks for that very anti-neoliberal sermon.
And but neoliberalism has been important in the UK because it's been here pretty much since Thatcher, and maybe even a bit earlier.
Yeah,
so since
Blair said something like Blair said he's the ideological descendant or grandson even of Thatcher.
Yeah, Thatcher she was asked what's your greatest achievement, and she was devil. Thatcher was asked what's your greatest achievement, and she was like New Labour, because Tony Benn, who's a socialist, Tony Benn, the very famous socialist,
he said New Labour. That's incredible.
She did, yeah, and so
that's a soundbite if I've ever heard one.
And so Tony Benn, who great socialist Labour MP, he was asked about New Labour, and he basically said it was apparent that at the higher echelons of the party, there was a discussion made, and the outcome was, if we are going to win power again, we have to adopt the fiscal policies of Margaret Thatcher neoliberalism. So, for example, PFIs, which was introduced by Labour, which is public financial initiatives, are massive contracts to companies. Is it PFIs?
Yeah, private finance initiative.
Private finance, yeah. PFIs was introduced by New Labour, and this is massive amounts of money for companies to do a job that a state company could do. And what's becoming clear is that a for-profit motive doesn't do better than anything else, than state-backed thing. But furthermore, under things like coronavirus, it is really suffering. And the effect is that we cannot react as a country towards this pandemic in a way we could do if it was state-controlled and state-managed. And the reality of neoliberalism is that it's at its core a reactionary ideology, reacting to what was called in one report by the Tri-Electoral Commission, which is a non-governmental discussion group essentially of different policy advisors and whatnot. This commission said there's been an over-democratization of the society, and a great way to bring this over-democratization down is through neoliberal policies. And that includes things like precarious employment. So Alan Greenspan, who was the...
but how would these policies de-democratize?
Well, so one thing was what's become clear in the last few decades is that the wages of the middle class and lower class is stagnating massively. And what that means is
Yeah.
that they cannot. One consequence of economic growth is that it heightens the tensions in society because people can spend more of their free time, not working and doing other things like political organizing, And so,
Yeah.
and this is what the report, the Crisis of Democracy by the Trilateral Commission, which was published in '75. This is what it points out, that this growth in especially the working class in the 50s and 60s has led to a situation in which tensions in society against the people, against the government in which its governability of the people is dependent on its control of the people, and are people who do not want to be controlled. And those tensions are heightened by economic growth. Neoliberalism, things like precarious employment, has really attacked growth of the working class and the middle class wage completely. And what it does is it concentrates wealth, because
And not only that, but because their income is stagnating whilst living prices increase. So it's almost the equivalent of basically you are on less money to buy more stuff, so you need to work even harder than you do. It's not even I feel like stagnation is even the wrong word here, because it's worsening.
Exactly, and there's a underlying political and ideological thrust to neoliberalism and market policies in which it takes away power from, in essence and in principle, publicly owned and publicly financed institutions, and companies, takes that money away and gives it to private companies. And private companies on the whole have worse worker conditions, tend to have worse wages and whatnot. All of this leads to a scenario in which there's a the decrease in wealth is also a decrease in power, and so there's a disempowering of the working class people and the middle class people. And the effect is, one of the major effects of this is just there's no political participation. I mean, voter turnout has decreased massively in the UK and basically around most of the world. And the reality is that this is purposely done so as to, one, control the people, or at least make them apathetic to politics as a whole. And again, as Marx said, the state.
And you think that's done by the neoliberal leaders? You think that's done by Thatcher, by Blair?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, if you compare,
and like with that intention of making voters apathetic, because I feel like I see Blair as always wanting to be in the spotlight. He was, I think, in our country, he was one of the first, to begin the celebrity.
Well, that's his role. That's his role in the government, is to play cheerleader. Because I mean, you cannot really understand the way the government works by looking at one individual. What it is a network of civil servants.
But Blair's government was so much of it was just Blair, throwing his weight around.
Yeah, it looked like Blair, but a major reason was that there was massive agreement with his policies from Labour MPs. Labour MPs were wooed because they had a massive majority, and so they could power down and follow him and support him and bring this on. And also Blair.
That let the party be championed by Blair and no one else.
Yeah, but also Blair. He again inherited Thatcher's neoliberalism, and what this meant is that there was a network of civil servants who also believed in the same thing and did the same things also, in terms of backing these policies and whatnot, and advising that these policies should be used. But also, a really important part is that neoliberalism has an important intellectual history also. People like Milton Friedman, Hayek. I mean, let's take Milton Friedman and his understanding of history, in which the free market, or the free the man, the free of the person. If you look at the US,
you mean the free of the market?
Yeah, the free of the market, the free of the person, or whatever. Yeah. Anyway, wonderful. If you look at America is highly protectionist. I mean, it's been It's been denounced repeatedly by the WTO.
Trade war after trade war.
Exactly, yeah. WTO for actions in Cuba, actions in Mexico, things like NAFTA, which is a North American finance trade agreement or something like this. That agreement is mostly about investors' rights, not really about free trade and whatnot. Because the result is you have a massive American state-financed agricultural sector, which is going against Mexico's. But moving on quickly. So yeah, a big part of I mean, there's a lot of contradictions because in reality, a lot of the money of, let's say, there's contradictions insofar as, let's take innovation, for example, which is championed as being bettered by the markets and being the result of market competition. I mean, let's take the internet. That was state-backed. That was created by the American state. Geolocation was created by the American state. If you look on your on your iPhone, the lithium battery was by the CIA. The touch screen was again CIA. I mean, a lot of the history of a lot of the inventions is basically they are state financed because research is very expensive, and the only people who can really do that is the state. State does it, and they bring it down to private companies, and private companies then exploit it for their own purposes. And you see, there's a contradiction there in which the excellence of the free market in a certain area is dependent upon the strength of the state. And even if you look at Britain, I mean, the British Empire, when the free market was introduced and was again in the mid 19th century with the Whigs and the anti-corn laws, when free trade really exploded as an idea economically, that was in the backdrop of a British state which for the last 2 centuries conducted vicious wars against the Dutch or the French or the Spanish, against the native populations in America, to dominate and control massive resources. And free market began when free market was introduced in Britain when Britain dominated the world. I mean, that's not the free market in any sense, as people like Milton Friedman understands it. It's really a sort of, it's when the world is handicapped. And when
it's a free market that had to be built on the viciousness of the British state and its
it was introduced.
Undeniable power.
It was introduced because the market then could act as a way to increase the power of British companies over other countries, because they could go open up your borders, and the result is that they're flooded by British commodities that can be made for cheap because they own the world. But also you can control where you go. So, for example, a lot of Britain's wealth was in its cotton industry for like 18th and 19th century, but that came from the fact that it went into India, invaded India, literally broke the thumbs of Indian cotton weavers, and then made India import English cotton, or made them import cotton and wool from England. And even in America up until the 20th century, that is what the story is. So they would go to places like Honduras, invade and make Honduras very cheaply because they had a sort of mafia country, or mafia government really, and made the Honduran people create these. I mean, 100% of Honduras's hot dogs in the 70s went straight to America. And that's not the free market. The free market is an ideological veil, and behind it is just vicious imperialism. But that, again, when you investigate it, neoliberalism is a highly contradictory ideology, which, in my opinion, is a way to reinforce the power through things like massive wealth inequality, to increase the power of the elite sectors in society.
Okay.
And this will heighten. And the result of that, in my opinion, is China. China is the perfected neoliberal model.
Insofar as gone full circle back to COVID-19. I was about to say we've digressed deeply from the original topic here.
Yeah.
So I think if we finish off on looking towards the future, where are we going to end up from? Yeah. Are we going to go back to normal? What are we going to do after this COVID? What is a COVID-19 issue? Where are we going to end up? Where are the means that we might have to take things like the app the NHS is producing, where is that going to lead us? This increased, authoritarian measures. I'm not saying, it's Stalinist or whatever, but increased authoritarian measures to, try and make sure the market can still function, try and keep us safe. Where will that lead us? And what do you think is the implication of, countries like China being supremely more successful than, than us or the USA or Italy or Germany or France in protecting themselves from COVID-19? Like, what is? Because I think we were all. I was so impressed when I saw that they built in China a 1,000-bed hospital, a 1,000-bed hospital in 3 days in Wuhan, and that could never happen in a democracy. It just couldn't. And the way China's been able to respond, instant, rapid response, and in a lot of, and I think the failures of, us and the US have just been laid so plain, especially with all these reports coming out that we knew it was going to happen. The US had a report came out last year saying they looked into what would happen if we had a swine-like flu pandemic. And guess what? They knew it would batter the Americans, and they did nothing. They knew that if this happened, they'd be shit on, and nothing happened. They didn't prepare themselves more. We knew. I don't know whether other countries knew, but to me, it's showing to the world, it's showing the success of non-democratic models. As you're saying, China's perfected neoliberal model. It's showing the success of that model and the failure of our model in tackling this pandemic. And it doesn't end at this pandemic. That's also been made clear, I think, by the science. We know that, I read somewhere, we should be expecting one of these every 5 years. Jesus Christ, every 5 years. Insane. But, this is by no means the end. And China for the last 20 years has just been going up and up and up in GDP, in its world status. It's going to overtake America. That's without a doubt. Do you think this is going to lead to a global shift? Is everyone going to have to, or not everyone, but are we going to see a move in some countries towards the Chinese model? Is America no longer our beloved world hegemon?
A great way to understand like the way policy is being created is like in the aftermath of World War II, there was a massive conference called the Bretton Woods Conference, which is basically how to restructure the world order around America, essentially, around the American dollar. And FDR, the president at the time of the US, had a rule that there should be no banker in Bretton Woods Conference. There should be no banker around these policy decisions and these policy makings that would basically determine the future of the world in the coming decades. And currently what we're seeing is where there is a massive mixing of state legislators around the world with private companies. And essentially the interests of of these individuals who represent institutions which want an increase in profit above anything else. That's their goal as capitalists. That's becoming the forefront of policy decision making. And if you look at the US, that's overtly true. Massive bailouts and massive loans to companies and corporations. So what was her name? Pelosi, who's the Speaker of the House of Representatives. She wanted something else in the sort of bailout bills, which is basically instead of Medicaid or Medicare or like single payer insurance covering coronavirus and coronavirus treatment, there would instead be you'd have to go through this basically like bureaucratic and privately financed program, which is extremely difficult and extremely complicated to then get the money so you can receive coronavirus treatment. Even the Democrats again championing a neoliberal response to the issues of the people in the day. And if you look at China, they are taking capitalism and this inherent design of society so that there are people at the top who manage the wealth of the country, people at the bottom who create the wealth of the country, and they're realizing what Marx predicted, which was that capitalism tends towards two directions: either sort of extremely authoritarian state in which you see in China, or a communist society. And I think,
Wait, you said capitalism tends to those two states?
yeah, to those two states, either a type of society in which there's massive control. Because if you look at capitalism, there's massive contradictions. Politically, we are told we are the governors of our own lives because we choose people who represent us. But in capitalism, the sets of our
Our employers set the terms of our lives in
exactly.
a lot of senses. Not entirely, obviously. There is more to life.
And the only way that does not the only way that's not completely true. The only reason why that's not completely true is because of trade unions. Because of collective action, in solidarity, pushing for better workers' rights. And I think there's a tendency, and neoliberalism is the extreme expression of capitalism in decay, which is this neoliberal authoritarian. And if you look at the actual like the wording of Chinese ideology, there was an article in the New York Times about 3 years ago about the Chinese former official who called China fascist, because there was Xi Jinping had this sort of wording where like some people should be at the top and some people should be at the bottom. And so that's one tendency in capitalism, because one way to solve the contradiction of, democracy and capitalism in a modern bourgeois liberal state is to just emphasize the bourgeois elements and the authoritarian elements. And that's what you're seeing in the US. So in the US, again, there is a tendency to look towards China and what it's doing as a way to revive its role as hegemon. But I don't think there should be complete hopelessness. I think massive changes. How am I going to word this? I think there's a way in which to better the situation. Fuck it. Revolution is politically viable.
Revolution.
Okay, and the other tendency of which I fully support is this new, different type of society in which we essentially upend the system and change the aims of production for profit to according to one's needs, essentially, from the Marx quote. But that transformation is a revolutionary one, a violent one, a very unstable one, and a very tricky one, and also experimental. I think revolution or communist revolution should be understood in that sense, and it should be understood as a way to solve the contradictions of society by emphasizing the democratic principles and realizing those democratic principles not just in the political domain, but also the economic domain, of which everything is based upon, like the distribution and the ownership of wealth. So I think we're coming to a point in which, if you look at all revolutions, they're basically extremely spontaneous acts that are a reaction to a dead end politically. So look at the French Revolution. The French Revolution comes out when the aristocracy does not want to make any more reforms, and so revolution begins. If you look at the USSR, the October Revolution was the same thing. It was basically the Mensheviks and the cadets didn't want to stop war or having war with Russia, and so they carried on the war to the great displeasure of the Russian peasants and the Russian proletariat. And so in reaction, the Russian proletariat lended their support, or at least their apathy, towards the Bolsheviks. And the Bolsheviks could do what they did in October because of the political inactivity of the ruling class. And whether we're at that scenario is very interesting. Maybe revolution.
Well, I think that is deeply optimistic to consider revolution. I think I think the Chinese model will become more attractive to people, but with
Fine people, I think it becomes attractive to the people at the top of the
well,
ruling.
but that's the thing. I think because I have almost no doubt that Trump will get in for a second term, so he'll be in until 2025,
Yeah.
and he will be staunchly anti-Chinese, even if he starts implementing or following slightly the Chinese model of having more surveillance and, as you said, data is the new oil.
Yeah.
I think he will still publicly be staunchly anti-Chinese, and I think that's important because I think he will want to find ways to differentiate and distinguish between him and the Chinese, and I think he will point out the errors, and there are obviously deep flaws in the Chinese way, and I think in that sense, for better or worse, maybe it pulls America down, and maybe nonetheless America will lose its hegemony and it will, push faster towards China. But I can't see the American national identity, being so freedom focused, and I can't see a leader like Trump actively or actively pursuing a policy similar to China's. I think where it would happen is maybe in the policy making rooms behind closed doors, things like the Patriot Act. The Patriot Act wasn't behind closed doors, but it would be, I think,
No,
smaller.
it was massively behind closed doors.
Oh, was it? Okay, my bad. But well then in that case, I think it would be things like the Patriot Act, which, I think publicly America would be keen to still promote its, land of the free type mentality, especially with a leader like Trump. I think, unfortunately, it's
China
sad to be.
China calls itself like a perfect democracy. It's the people's country. It's the people's thing. And I think at the end of the day,
who believe? Do the Chinese believe it?
No, but
Yes.
Yeah, but if you ask, taking American democracy works much like Iran. So Iran chooses the candidates who can run. So the Supreme Council chooses. In America, the capitalists in the corporate interests essentially throw money at a particular candidate, and then the candidates' ability to conform themselves with the interests of the corporations also reflects their possibility of success. Bernie Sanders, in a way, was, I don't want to say this, but sort of destined. Well, yeah, destined for failure because he didn't conform himself enough to the interests of corporate America. But Biden certainly is. He's exceedingly conforming to the interests of the corporate interests, and so are the Republicans, and they can get away with a lot. And I think electoralism, voting, could only act as electoralism can only act as a strong enough barricade to a tendency towards China, and that tendency is a sort of a perversion of the democratic process that's worsening and worsening and worsening, again due to neoliberalism, an inherently incoherent and contradictory ideology that for the most part serves to justify the increase in the inequality and also imperialism.
Well, we've been talking for about an hour. We've covered a lot. I think we've delved into other topics other than what we set out to begin with. I don't even know if we followed the structure we set out to begin with, but nonetheless, for our second ever podcast, I think that was an interesting conversation. I hope you enjoyed as well. If you did, leave a like, leave a comment, and we will see you next week in yet another podcast. So we'll be posting on our Instagram when we are making a podcast, and if you perhaps want to be involved in one, if you're politically engaged and you have a topic you'd like to speak to us about, just either leave a comment on the video or send us a DM on Instagram, and we'll see what we can do. We'd love to have some people on. We think that would be great. yeah, hope you enjoyed, and have a
Bye.
lovely day. Stay
Goodbye,
politically engaged.
comrades, brothers and sisters.
Goodbye, my darling comrades.